Hey folks. So when I was first in college and had first joined a competitive speech and debate team, I had a really bad habit. And so what would happen when I was in a debate round, I would always go up to the front of the room to give my speech, and I would stand behind the lectern. And as soon as I had made my first main point, I would smack that lectern as hard as I could for nice, solid emphasis. Because that's what good delivery is about, right? Not so much. Today's lecture is about delivery in formal speeches. Over the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through the process of having good style and delivery in the presentations that you do in this class, and hopefully guide you away from some of the horrible things that I did when I was a novice public speaker. So why does delivery matter so much, right? Why do we spend so much time and concern figuring out what all this is about? Well, glad you asked. A couple of reasons. First, I think it's important to understand that there is a key difference between formal versus informal public style, right? When it comes to formal public style, this is the type of style that we're going to learn in this class, and it's a style that's designed to avoid distraction and ultimately allow you to establish better credibility with your audience, where as opposed to more informal methods of delivery tend to work great when having conversations and engaging with small group, but don't look as good and polished when on a big stage. So I think one of the best ways to think about this is when you learn to give these more formal style of presentations, what you're really trying to learn is like the public speaking equivalent to the way that you go about writing an essay versus like composing an email or a text to a friend, right? There is different language used, different methods used, and just like having a conversation and giving a speech are going to be different. I think the last thing that we'll mention here is that when an audience evaluates a speech, the delivery, what is presented both verbally through tone and non-verbally through things like movement and gestures, tend to be the most obvious component of the delivery. So making sure that these are things that come across polished and well is one of the best ways that you can have a really effective speech. So I think one of the first and most important things to discuss when it comes to giving a presentation is having effective eye contact. Eye contact is one of the most powerful tools that you can use as a speaker because it's one of the key ways that you can connect with your audience. Now, most folks at some point or another had the really bad advice given to them that if you're going to give a speech, the best way to go about this is to find a spot in the back of the room and stare at that spot while you give your presentation. That way you don't feel nervous because you don't make eye contact. Well, as you can guess, doing something like this is really obvious and you keep like looking up behind you trying to figure out what the heck that person is looking at. So don't do that. Use eye contact as a means to connect with your audience. And there's a couple key ways that you can go about doing that. First, when you are in front of the audience, you should always attempt to try to scan the room, right? Take kind of an idea at how big of a space you're in and try to kind of like make eye contact across the audience as you work through the presentation. This will help each audience member feel more connected to you as a speaker and will have that degree of engagement. I think the key thing to remember along with that is that your focus during the presentation should primarily be on the audience, which means that you shouldn't be looking at the notes in your hand more than you absolutely have to, and you definitely shouldn't be staring back at a screen as you give your presentation, because all that time that you're not looking at the audience, you're missing a chance at making connection. One of the best things that you can do is not attempt to memorize your speech and instead work on having an extemporaneous style of delivery where you have limited notes that are designed to help you move through your presentation so that you don't have to read off them directly, but it can give you the key point so that you can return your audience and your focus back to the audience. I think the last thing that I'll mention here before I move on, also avoid the tendency to stare directly at one person for the entirety of the audience, especially because more often than not, it tends to be the instructor and it's just weird. Scan the room, things will be better. Stage movement. One of the things that gives folks trouble when they first start practicing public speaking is how to manage where they're at on the stage. If you've ever had a chance to go back and watch some of the campaign presentations that John McCain gave when he was running for election in 2008, one of the bad habits that Senator McCain had is that he was a pacer, and he loved to walk back and forth on the stage. The problem with this is that that is a really distracting use of movement, and more often than not, the audience starts to become more focused on that than they are on the message, which ultimately isn't a good thing, especially when you're trying to convince people to vote for you to be in the highest office in the United States. That said, there are some ways that we can use stage movement to be far more useful to us as we move through formal methods of public speaking. One of the things that we'll be talking about in this class and that I want you to try to utilize is the idea that you can use movement to visually show movement between ideas for your audience. When you give your typical formal speech in a public speaking class, there's going to be three kind of major parts that tend to get broken down into 5 pieces: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. The body tends to contain somewhere between 2 to 3 main points. And so what you can do is you can use stage movement to transition between those main points so that when you're walking from one place in the stage to another place in the stage, you're showing your audience that you are done with a main point and that you are moving on to the next one. And this can be really useful. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to do this, and for the most part, as long as you're using movement to show movement between ideas, you're doing well. But really advanced speakers, especially speakers that compete on the intercollegiate level, use something known as a speaker's triangle as a technique to be able to accomplish this. And we're going to get to that more in a second when we get to the spotlight. But if you look to the visual aid here on the screen, you can kind of get the basic idea. The speaker's triangle has a speaker starting dead center in the middle of the room for their introduction. When they finish their introduction, they say a transition statement like, great, now that we've discussed this, let's go ahead and talk about our first main point. And why they're saying that transition statement, they are walking from the place in the room where they started the speech over to one of the corners of the room where they will then plant themselves and give the first main point of the body of the presentation. This is really useful for a couple of reasons. One, as I've already mentioned, it shows movement between ideas, but also it puts you in a different place, going back to the previous discussion, which will allow you to better scan the room and maybe even make some eye contact with some people that you couldn't see when you were standing directly in the center, some folks that were maybe off to the edges and off to the side. After that first main point is done, the speaker then again will use a transition statement to signal that they are moving from the first main point to the second main point, and while they are saying that transition statement, they will walk to the other side of the room, plant themselves for the entirety of the third main point, do the same thing after the third main point, transition statement to the last main point, and then finally as they finish the presentation, they'll do another transition statement back to the center where they'll go ahead and give their conclusion. While it may seem weird at first, it's a really effective style and it really can help your audience. So let's go ahead and move on to today's spotlight. Today's spotlight is about the speaker's triangle. The clip that we're going to watch today shows a competitive speaker using the speaker's triangle to incorporate some movement into the presentation. Now, we've cut off all the bulk of the speech, so we're not going to make you sit here and watch a 10-minute presentation, but this clip is going to skip from each of the main points so that you can see the transition statement and the movement that the speaker is using as they move from point to point in this presentation. Let's go to the clip.
In June 2016, the United States was attacked. So first, the problem. Cyber warfare creates 2 issues with critical implications. So, now that we've hacked into the major problems, we can decode the underlying causes. These problems and causes demand action. So, now let's fish for the necessary solution. So today, we hacked into the major problems surrounding cyber warfare. Then, we decoded the underlying causes, and finally, executed some solutions.
A couple key takeaways from that is, feel free to go back and watch this over if it's helpful for you. You can notice how as she finished each kind of end part of the speech, there was a little bit of a summary about where she's been, and then she would actually say that transition statement as she moved from main point to main point. So this is a pretty good example and something I encourage you to incorporate in your own stage movement in the speeches that you give in this class. Great, let's move on. Gestures. Gestures can be a really great way to enhance your presentation, and they can be a way that you can really mess up presentation. So let's talk a little bit about trying to find the right balance of gestures in a presentation. So the goal here is to keep gesturing throughout the entirety of your presentation, but to do so in a natural way. The last thing I'll say on gestures before we move on is if you're really struggling how to gesture naturally during the presentation, it tends to be one of those things that only happens to folks when they get in front of a room. So try to pay attention to how you gesture when you're just having conversations with friends, do a little spying on them and watch how they gesture, and ultimately try to incorporate that into the presentation. One more note here on notes is if you're going to use note cards during your presentation, I encourage you to always keep your notes in a single hand, because if you try to hold your notes in both hands, what this will prevent you from doing is gesturing naturally during your presentation. And if you hold them both, it also makes you appear really closed off, which is not good when trying to establish some connection with your audience. So keep those notes in one hand, only touch notes with both hands when you're changing cards, and then go back to it. Also, it's fine to let your free hand fall to your side and bring it up when you're ready to do a big gesture. The next thing that I want to talk about is the concept of vocal variety. Now, what vocal variety relates to is both the tone and the volume and the rate that you give during your presentation. So a couple of things to keep in mind. First off, it's important to use the tone and volume that is appropriate for the size room that you were in. If you find yourself giving a presentation in a really small space, you need to make sure that you adapt the volume so it doesn't appear that you're yelling at people for the entirety of the presentation. But likewise, if you find yourself giving a presentation to a really large room, you're going to have to increase your volume level, really speak from that diaphragm so that you're able to be heard throughout the entirety of the room. Moving on, there's a couple other things to consider with vocal variety. First off, having a steady pace can be really useful to keeping your audience interested. If your pace slows down and you feel less into it, that's going to translate to your audience and they're going to be less interested in what you have to say. So keep things moving at a pretty good beat as you move through your presentations. The next thing that I'll mention is that it's important to make sure that your tone is appropriate for your content. Another mistake that I made when I was first out of grad school and I was teaching one of my first public speaking classes is I gave the advice to a student that look, when it comes to tone, the most important thing is to be upbeat and excited because that's going to get your audience interested. And while that advice on surface level isn't so bad, it's not so great when someone is giving a persuasive speech on stopping genocide and they seem really excited and happy about genocide. So make sure that your tone matches the content and is natural and appropriate. The last thing is you want to try to mix it up a little bit. Having a speech that just goes 100 miles an hour for the entirety is going to be a little bit of exhausting. Likewise, going too slow is going to have some problems of keeping your audience interested. You should build as you work through the presentation and have kind of peaks and valleys to your vocal variety, and that'll help create a roller coaster ride that keeps your audience interested in what you have to say. Language. So obviously language is a pretty important component of giving a presentation, but using language effectively is really the trick. So let's talk about a couple things to consider when forming the language for your presentation. First off, pronunciation. Saying words correctly is a really important way when it comes to establishing your credibility with your audience. It used to be, if you didn't know how to say a word, you either had to phone a friend or trying to figure out those little diagrams that exist in the dictionary, which to this day I still haven't figured out. The nice thing about today is if there's a word that you do not know how to pronounce, there's a really useful resource online through internet videos that allows you to look this up. So if there's ever a word you don't know how to say, just hop on Google and search how to pronounce and then put that word on there, or how to say and put that word in there, and you're going to pull up a nice video guide which will probably be pretty useful to you in saying things correctly. The next thing that I'll mention is that of using good word choice. When you give a formal presentation, it's an opportunity to show how verbose your lexicon is. In other words, it's a chance to use more formal, good language and good words to be able to improve the quality of your presentation. What you don't want to do is to incorporate too much common vernacular or slang in your presentation, because those types of choices can ultimately impact your credibility with your audience. The last thing that I'll mention here is that of verbal fillers. First off, verbal fillers are a natural part of speaking and something that you have to really work on to improve. They can impact your presentation, so I will give a couple pieces of advice. First off, if you find yourself in one of those feedback loops where you keep saying the same word repetitively, especially if it's a like, or one of those, a good strategy is to go ahead and incorporate some pauses into your delivery style. And when you feel the need to say, instead of saying it out loud, pause for a second, let that word process non-verbally in your mind, and then continue. Audiences don't tend to notice pauses as much as they do as those repetitive terms. Last but not least here is that of appearance. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind here. When it comes to dressing for success in presentations, it's useful to know that there is a correlation between feeling more comfortable and looking really good when you give a presentation. In fact, there has been some research to support that when people dress up, they tend to have less issues with speech anxiety and general nervousness. Now, in the classes that I teach, I don't require folks to wear suits and ties, but by all means, if you would like to, you are welcome to, and they do have a relationship to enhancing the credibility with your audience. That said, I think it's important to think about what you're wearing and how that presents to your audience, and so do some things that help improve it. First off, I would say avoid wearing like hats while giving a presentation. Try to make sure that the clothing that you wear is not overly wrinkled or messy, and just doing some basic things and kind of going for a more business casual look is probably going to have a nice medium effect on your audience, where they find you credible, but also where you feel comfortable as you give that presentation. All right, well, that wraps up our discussion on delivery. All of these techniques are useful and really impact the presentation and the speech that you can give. You'll also notice on the rubrics in my classes that these categories that we just discussed are the same categories that I'm looking for you. So I encourage you to check those out, because it's going to be a key thing in every presentation, and we're going to be looking for improvement as we work our way through it. So, thanks for watching, folks. Have an awesome day.